Good morning. Um, the sun is shining today. We haven't seen that in a while. That's good news. And want to let anybody who's watching my video know that we are meeting currently in our homes because rent is ridiculous. But we are looking for somewhere we can afford, so bear with us. Here in our home, we have pets. You may see a cat pop in, you may hear a dog bark, but understand that that's the circumstances right now. Let's pray first. Heavenly Father, we thank you for the sun today. We thank you for the ability to meet together. Father God, we ask you that you bless today, that you give us the ability to take this message into heart and let it plant a seed and change our lives. God, I give you my voice today. I give you my voice, and let me hear your voice, and let me only speak what you would have me speak. So today's message, crazy instructions and crazy blessings. There's a quote by Ginger Harrington that I feel is appropriate for this message. So God's call is incomplete until we respond. So let's start with Joshua 6. This is the story of the Jericho walls. And as you know, the Israelites have been wandering in the wilderness for 40 years. Now they've gotten to Jericho. And the only thing that stands between them and the promise that God had given them was the walls of Jericho. And so the people in Jericho had seen the Israelites outside their walls, and so they Katie barred the doors. They said no one goes in and no one goes out because they were afraid of the God of the Israelites. And so then something totally insane happens. God gives Joshua these bizarre battle plan. And he says, Joshua, I want you to take the Ark of the Covenant. And I want you to have these 7 priests with shofars in front of the Ark of the Covenant. Now, Joshua, I want you in front of them to have part of your army. And then I want you to put the rear guard. But the plan got crazier. He says, I want the priest to be blowing their shofars the entire time. And then I want everybody else to walk in complete silence. And I want them to march 6 times around the walls of Jericho like this. Now, you know, Joshua was probably standing there thinking, what? But then he told him, now on the 7th day, I want you to march 7 times. And on that last lap, I want the priest to make a loud blast on their trumpets or their shofars. And what I want you to do, Joshua, is shout and say, shout, for the Lord has given us the city. That should be our shout. And so maybe it sounded insane, but they did it anyway. And the walls fell. Except for this one section. It still stood. Why? Well, there was this lady that lived there, and her name was Rahab. And when Joshua sent the spies in to spy out Jericho, 2 of the spies were going to be captured by the people in Jericho. And so Rahab, you know what she did? She took and hid these 2 spies because she said, your God, I've seen your God. And so she hid them in her home and risked her life. And so when she let them down out of her home, it was with a scarlet cord a red scarlet cord. And the spies told her, when we come in to capture Jericho, let that cord be hanging from your apartment, and God's going to protect you and your family. Crazy thing, Rahab was the great, great, great grandmother of our Messiah, Jesus. Another crazy thing, she was in the lineage, biblically in the lineage of Jesus, but she was Rahab, the prostitute. That goes to show God can use anybody. And you know what? God said, march in silence. And I think that's because he knew these Israelites, while they wandered in the wilderness, they griped, they complained, they moaned. They had a problem with everything that God did, everything that Moses said. And so he said, be quiet. I don't want you talking. And what if, when they heard this crazy, bizarre plan that God had given them, they said, this is foolishness. We're going to look like idiots. We're going to look stupid. And they sat down and they didn't do what God told them to do. Well, the walls would have never fallen, would they? They would have never fallen, and they would have never received the promise that God had given them. God's power is not limited by human logic. But our obedience can limit God's power in our life. We got to trust God. We got to trust him even when it doesn't make sense. Psalms 18:29, for by you I can run through a troop and I can leap over a wall. That's exactly, you look at it, that is exactly what happened to the Jericho walls. They fell inward, and he says they became like a ramp so that the Israelites, the army, could go up this ramp and into Jericho. So even when God gives you weird marching orders, it is God's ability, not yours. The walls of Jericho was a gateway for the Israelites into what God had promised them. Maybe the walls represent in our lives the barrier between us and our spiritual breakthrough. Maybe the walls represent the barrier to our answered prayers. Maybe we're entering a new season and the enemy has made it appear that there's walls between us and that season. You see, there was priests, there were shofars, there were soldiers, there was the Ark of the Covenant, there were marching orders that didn't make sense, and there were walls. God's battle plan for them sounded insane, but the walls fell. Sometimes God calls you to the weird so that he can show you the unbelievable. What walls are standing between you and your answered prayers? I mean, seriously, what walls are standing? But you know what? God's strategy doesn't need your permission. And you can't stop on lap 6 because it looks like nothing's happening. can't stop on lap 6 because it looks like you're stupid. Because you know something else. Because you know why? Because in that moment, when it looks like nothingness, God isn't doing nothing. He's working. What looks like 6 days of crazy can mean on the 7th day your wall's falling. Every wall before you does have an expiration date in God's timeline. Every wall before you is shaking because it heard your silence, but yet it still heard your worship. It heard the shofars of God blowing. 2 Chronicles 20, there's another crazy story. You see, the prophet goes to the king, and he tells the king and the nation that the battle was not theirs, it was the Lord's. And because the king heard that, he did something that sounded incredibly stupid. He says, I want the worshipers to go before the army. There's another army on the other side, but the worshipers show up before them. And the worshipers are singing, oh, give thanks to the Lord, for his steadfast love endures forever. And they raised their voices together and they worshiped. And it caused chaos, complete total chaos in the enemy's camp, the enemy's side. And they turned on one another with their swords. And the whole army was killed. You see, worship also seems weird, doesn't it? Doesn't it sometimes you're in church and it seems weird to raise your hands in worship? Those of you who do it can remember those first few times that it seems so uncomfortable. Does it seem weird to make yourself sing aloud because you're uncomfortable with your own voice? What if God called you to dance? It all seems strange, even if we're at home by ourselves. It seems weird. And yet, here you are, and the wall is before you, keeping you from your promise. And when you worship, the enemy can't get it because he thinks he's got you held captive. And it causes chaos in the enemy's camp. So then there's another thing. Silence is actually a weapon. Psalms 18:21, I like the Message version. It says, words kill and words give life. They're either a poison or they're a fruit. You choose. You choose. The wall before you isn't the problem, you guys. The problem that we have is unbelief. And you got to stop looking at that wall before you and thinking it's huge. Nothing's going to change. And you have to turn around. Sincerely turn around and look at the eyes of your Lord behind you. Those eyes that says, I love you. Those eyes that says, surrender and trust me, even though I have given you a bizarre and crazy battle plan. Surrender and trust me. So we have a story here. And I want you to, one thing, I'm going to back up here. Your obedience needs to be louder than the doubts in your head. So here we have a story. The command God gave Joshua did not make sense. Human logic considered it foolishness. The commitment to the plan, though, never changed. They kept walking. They kept blowing their shofars. And silence was their weapon. They didn't speak a word. Then there's one huge point here. The celebration of praise happened before the walls ever came down. So 1 Corinthians 1:27 tells us that God uses the foolish things and God uses the weak things. Faith makes you look ridiculous until it doesn't. I'm going to say that again. Faith makes you look ridiculous until it doesn't. So then we have another story. And this is in Judges 6. The Israelites have been taken captive and by the Mennonites. Now it tells us here that the Mennonite army can't be counted. It's more than all the sands of the sea, guys. It's more numerous than the locusts. And so the Mennonites would come in and they would take all the crops and they would take all the livestock. And it left Israel to a place where they couldn't sustain their own selves. And so Israel cried out to God. And there was this young man, and his name was Gideon. And Gideon was hiding in the wine press. And you see, a wine press is a deep pit where they crush the grapes. But the thing is Gideon was hiding in the wine press, threshing the wheat. He wasn't in the wheat threshing floor. He was hiding. Gideon had gotten to a place where he was fearful. And he was only surviving. And many of us are at that place sometimes. And so then it says the angel of the Lord appeared to Gideon. In the Old Testament, when you read the angel of the Lord, it is referring to Jesus. And not an angel of the Lord. I don't want you to get confused here. Not an angel of the Lord, but when it says the angel of the Lord. And so Jesus appears to Gideon. He shows up, of course, where Gideon is hiding. And he said, "The Lord is with you, O mighty warrior." O mighty warrior. Remember, Gideon was hiding. And if you go into Judges 6, you read that Gideon was insecure. He was full of doubt. He was fearful. And Gideon was also faithless. But Jesus calls him they calls him a mighty warrior. Romans 4:17 tells us God calls the things that be not as though they are. He doesn't call you who you are. He calls you who you'll be. And that shows us God has faith in us. So when I was studying this, I realized, I'm going to be honest with you, I'm a lot like Gideon. And reading this story made me realize that. Because in verse 13, Gideon says, I think what I've thought, and maybe you have thought the same thing. He said, "Sir, if the Lord is really with us, why is all this happening?" And then he went a step further and he said, "If the Lord is with us, why aren't the things happening here like they happened with our ancestors?" He had heard those stories. I've read the stories in the Bible. Where's the miracles, God? Where's the provision, God? Where are the people, God? Where's the building? You gave me this vision. God, why are the things happening in my life like they are? And again, maybe you felt the same way. But you see, Jesus turned around. And I want us to hear these words. He looked at Gideon and he said, "Go in the strength you have. I am sending you." Did you hear that? He said to Gideon, a man that was hiding, a man that is insecure, a man who is faithless and has doubts. He found him. Well, he didn't find him. He knew where he was. But he went to him in the wine press. He called him a mighty warrior. And he looked and said, "Go in the strength you have. I'm sending you." But then the thing that happens to so many of us, Gideon's doubts, his insecurity begin to talk. How can I? How can I? Have you asked that before? You hear his voice, you hear him calling you to do something that doesn't make sense to you. And you've asked, how can I? But then Jesus turns to him and looks him in the eyes and he said, "Because I will be with you." But you know what? Here Gideon has had this conversation with Jesus, face to face. He had something we don't have. And 3 different times, he said, "God, give me a sign. Give me a sign that this is what you want me to do. I've talked to you. I've heard your voice, God. But give me a sign." So the first thing is he looked at Jesus and he said, "Wait on me. Don't leave. I'll be right back." And he goes and gets, I think it was bread and meat. Can't remember exactly. And he brings it to him. He set it on the rock, and Jesus took his staff, touched the rock. Boom. It all burns up. It becomes a sacrifice. Then Gideon says, "Hey, I'm going to lay my fleece here on the ground. Now, if in the morning it's wet and the ground is dry, I'll believe that you're sending me." Well, then he says, "Wait a minute. That's not enough. I want to get up in the morning and the ground be wet and my fleece be dry." It's a lot like us. God, give me a sign. Let somebody somewhere, please, God, give me a prophetic word. Let me hear from them what you've already told me. Now, Gideon gets some ridiculous battle plans. We think Jericho is crazy. You got to listen to this. All right. So we've already read that the Mennonites was so huge that they outnumbered the sands of the sea. Now Gideon has 32,000 troops with him. And God says that's too many. I want you to go ask them who's fearful. So Gideon goes and does that, and guess what? 22,000 troops left him. And then God looks at Gideon and says, "That's too many." And I'm sure Gideon was like, "Whoa, wait a minute. Wait a minute, God." But God tells him, take them to the creek, and the ones who lay down on the ground and lap the water like a dog, send them home. But the ones who kneel and take the water in their hands, that's your guys. Well, Crazy thing is, Gideon was left with 300 to face the Midianites. Now, you think that's crazy? Hang on. Then God says, all right, I want you to put in one hand in these troops, I want you to put, remember, I've just left my mind, a shofar. And in the other hand, I want you to put a jar with a torch hid in it. And that's what I want you to go to battle with. Not a sword, not a spear, not a shield. And you're going to face all these Midianites. This and this. That made completely no sense. Because God uses the foolish things to confound the wise. And God uses the weak things to show the strong that they're interesting. So we've got the shofars and we've got the torches hidden in the jars, the clays of jar. And they get to the camp and God had told them to divide this group of 300 into 3 groups. And he said, then blow your shofars all together. So 300 shofars blow. And then he said, break your jars of clay so that your light shines. Well, like a story we've already heard, they're obedient and they do these things. All of these Mennonites turn on themselves and they kill each other in chaos. And those that didn't die took off running. Gideon and those troops didn't need a weapon. They never raised a sword. They didn't have one. They defeated this huge army with a shofar, a jar of clay, and a hidden torch. Gideon, a faithless, insecure man. God spoke over him, Jesus spoke over him that he was a mighty warrior. And you see, because in our weakness, God always makes provisions for our weaknesses, for our doubts, for our insecurities. God makes provisions. And so I need to read to you 2 Corinthians 4, 7, and 9. Give me just a minute to pull this up. I'll get there. 2 Corinthians 4. And I'm going to read this out of the Passion Translation. 4, 7 through 9. We are like common clay jars that carry the glorious treasure within, so that this immeasurable power will be seen as God's and not ours. Though we experience every kind of pressure, we're not crushed. And at times we don't know what to do, but quitting isn't an option. We are persecuted by others, but God has not forsaken us. We may be knocked down, but we are not out. And so we hear that we have this light inside of us, this immeasurable power inside our clay jars. And when I read this story of Gideon and Jericho, I thought about several different stories that I've read in the Bible where God used crazy, bizarre, weird plans to bring about his plan. And Moses had a voice talk to him from a burning bush that never burned up. David, a young man, killed a giant with a sling and a stone, not a sword or a spear. And if you remember Goliath, every man in the troop of Israel was afraid of that giant. Then we have a virgin who gave birth to our Messiah. Peter, an ordinary man, walked on the water. And he didn't just walk in the water, you know that? He walked on the water during a storm. A donkey talked to the prophet. Noah built an ark saying it was going to rain, and nobody knew what rain was because it had never rained before. And Jesus used a cross, a symbol of shame, to bring about salvation to the world. To me, Jericho and Gideon teach us that God's greatest victories often come through the most unexpected people and the most unexpected methods. Why? Because if that happens, nobody, absolutely nobody, guys, is going to be able to stand and deny that God deserves the glory. God used marching and silence and shouting instead of an invasion and weapons. And the walls came down. God will never be limited by what he has to work with. He's just looking for someone to trust him and obey him. But I was also thinking, like the jars of clay, where we read that God's power is within those jars of clay. Sometimes our jars of clay have to be broken. And why? Because we're human beings, right? We haven't got it all together. At least I haven't. Like I told you, I relate to Gideon. But sometimes we got to have pride and fear and insecurities, doubts and numbness to the things of God. They got to go. They got to be broken off. And because if God can use a shout, a sling, a rock, a shofar, imagine what God can do in your life if these things are gone. And if we let God do the breaking, he's going to use our voice. He's going to use our praise. He's going to use our light, and sometimes our silence, because God has to change our identity before he can change our circumstances. And we have a light inside that clay jar, and those clay jars had to be broken so that their light, their torch, shined. Even if the plan sounds radical, I don't want you to despise who you are, as some of us do. Don't see yourself unqualified, because God qualifies you, not this world, and not even yourself. You can't count yourself out, because you see, you're created for this season. I believe God wants to use each one of you. I believe each one of you has a calling on your life. And in God's hands, weakness becomes strength. This is Sophie. The insecure become warriors. The fearful become fearless. And the unusual become unstoppable. I don't want you leaving here today thinking about your Jericho walls. I don't want you to leave today here, people, thinking, what battle will I be fighting next week? What you need to ask yourself is, can I trust God even if my calling looks strange, even if my calling looks weird. Can I trust him? Even if to my friends and my family, I look foolish. Now there is one thing about a guy that had the most bizarre calling upon his life, that God gave him an assignment that all of us would think, oh, wait a minute. And I don't believe God's going to call you to this, but it was Isaiah. And in Isaiah 23, God told Isaiah for 3 years to walk around naked. Because out of this, he was going to show Israel they were going to be stripped of all their wealth, and they were going to be captured by the Assyrians. Naked in a city for 3 years was his assignment. So I don't want you to come in here next week saying, hey, God called me in Isaiah. I'm naked. God isn't going to do that because he doesn't want to see you. We don't want to see you, excuse me, naked, please. God's going to win his battle his way, not our way. And it says his ways are not our ways, right? His thoughts are not our thoughts. They're higher than what we can think. So even though you feel inadequate, even though you feel sometimes unqualified, like we just talked about, maybe you feel like Gideon, you're insecure, you got doubts, you're hiding. But when God calls you and tells you it's your turn, you're up to bat, then you're going to hit a home run. You're going to win that battle. So we looked at Gideon, and Gideon was hiding in the wine press, right? If you are hiding in that wine press, I want to tell you that is not your address. And God is firing all your soldiers. And you got to break your jar. You got to let your light shine. And you have to blow your shofar. When God tells you to be loud, baby, you got to be loud. And God will turn what looks like chaos in your life into a victory. Gideon was from the tribe of Manasseh. And Joseph named his first child, well, it's either Manasseh or anyway, I may have said it wrong. Manasseh. That's how you say it. And I believe God was speaking a word to us with this, because this means God has made me forget all my hardships and all my father's house. Joseph was thrown into the pit by his own brothers. And so in Hebrew, this means he causes me to forget my pain. Maybe you have trauma. And maybe it's that trauma. Could it be that trauma that makes you so insecure that you don't want to be embarrassed if God calls you to do something crazy? If God's assignment looks radical or foolish in your life, you don't want to be embarrassed before your family. But can you allow God to break that jar? Can you allow him to change your identity? So let me ask you, what if this crazy idea God has is the answer to the prayer you've been praying? Is it worth stepping out? Is it worth the cost? I mean, marching around walls in silence with only blowing shofars didn't make sense. It sure as heck didn't make sense that Gideon went before the Mennonites, this huge army with 300 men. Shofars, a clay jar, and a torch hidden in it. That assignment sounds stupid, doesn't it? Your calling's not going to make sense sometimes. He calls you unqualified. He calls you insecure. Because even when you have doubts, when you are obedient and when you surrender, He gets the glory. So, when it doesn't make sense, when it isn't human logical, do it anyway. Do it anyway. Maybe you don't understand, but trust Him anyway. Because you see, the world says, bring me more, and God says, trust me with less. The world says, fight harder. God says, obey deeper. The world says that it's foolish and it's never going to work out. And God says, baby, hold on and watch me work. I'm not going to tell you that it's easy to surrender. I struggle. Not going to tell you it's easy to obey. Because sometimes it's hard to trust. Especially when it seems like nothing's changing. But that's when you lean into the worship. And that's when you stop looking at that wall and it looks bigger than God. We got to turn around and look into our Father's eyes and see His love. Thank you.